and deputy chair of the Stop the War Coalition in the UK. He served under Jeremy Corbyn from 2011 to 2015. He was one of the main organizers on February 15th. It's when an anti-war protest against the invasion of Iraq. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks very much, Jehan, and thanks to everyone who's been involved in organising this meeting. I think it's a very important moment, to be honest. I think we're taking today the first step towards creating an international campaign against the war on Yemen. And that's very important. I think it's, to be honest, long overdue. The situation, in my opinion, in Yemen is absolutely intolerable. I think it should be a matter of deep shame for the governments of the West who have been playing a key part and have played a key part in creating the catastrophe that exists in that country. And Yemen was in fact declared the worst humanitarian catastrophe in the world in, I believe, 2018. But since then, incredibly, and despite the existence of the global pandemic, the situation has actually got worse because the war has intensified and the blockade has actually been tightened. And we're now in a situation where 2/3 of the population of Yemen can't afford to buy food and are therefore dependent on aid. Over 1 million are suffering from cholera. And another result of the blockade and the war has been the decimation of the health service, which has meant, obviously, a huge increase in the level of misery and suffering under the pandemic. And the UN reports now that Yemen is the country with the highest rate of undeclared coronavirus deaths anywhere in the world. And if you want a further measure of the kind of callous indifference of what is laughingly called the international community, you just need to know this simple fact, that since last April, since the moment when the pandemic spread around the globe, UN aid for Yemen has been halved. The total UN aid budget for the country has been halved, partly due to savage cuts to the aid budget from the Gulf states and in particular Saudi Arabia. So it's a catastrophic situation. It's the worst humanitarian situation anywhere in the world. And I think we need to be clear about three other things about what is going on in Yemen. First, this is not a natural disaster. The over 100,000 estimated deaths and the intense misery of the Yemeni people are entirely man-made and entirely avoidable. The crisis began quite simply in 2015 when the Saudis launched their war and the accompanying blockade, and it has deepened every year since. And the second thing I think we need to insist on as a movement is that, in particular, Britain and the United States are keeping the war going by their military, political and economic support for Saudi Arabia. Both countries have special forces involved in the war, although they sometimes deny it. Both countries have been deepening ties with bin Salman's government during the war years, and both countries have been arming that government to the teeth. Donald Trump restarted arms sales to Saudi in 2017. And despite a court case in Britain outlawing arms licenses to Saudi Arabia, Britain this year in June restarted those sales. The figures aren't public, but I think it's almost certain that Saudi Arabia is the biggest single recipient of UK arms sales. For both countries, Saudi Arabia is a key ally, and this war and the continuation of this war is absolutely essential because of their strategic alliance against Iran in the Middle East. And the third thing, and the last thing I want to stress, is that I think we have to be clear that the war could be ended tomorrow. The Saudi regime is facing a serious economic crisis. The war coalition that they have headed up and put together is fracturing, and the war itself is stalemated. It's an absolutely huge drain on Saudi resources, and it now looks from their point of view like an open-ended commitment. And I believe there's every likelihood that the regime is looking for a way out. In other words, our governments, the US governments, the British government, to some extent the French government, by enthusiastically pursuing the war, are standing in the way of a resolution to the most serious human crisis on the planet. This is how high the stakes are. This is how serious the situation is. And I think, just to end on, I want to stress that there is actually growing opposition to the war, certainly in Britain, I think in the United States, and probably in other parts of the world. In Britain, our lobbying operation, where we've been trying to put pressure on members of parliament to oppose the war and to raise the question of the war, that lobbying operation has escalated, has become much more popular in the last few months. And for the first time in Britain, in alliance with Yemeni British organisations, we've been able to organise some serious, sizable demonstrations against the war over the summer. And I think the purpose of today's meeting is to publicise the situation, to promote the arguments over the war, but also to commit ourselves to building an international movement on scale to end this absolutely catastrophic war. And I think if we can do that, and if we can turn a day of action that we're proposing on January the 25th into a sizable show of protest and demonstration around the world, and if our governments begin to come under public scrutiny, they simply won't be able to defend their actions. I think we can make a difference in this situation, and we need to seriously begin the process now of building an international, not just a coalition, but an international campaign to end the disaster of war in Yemen.